hey, 1 2, 2 2, check check. Hey hey, 2 2.
Well, we also recently switched to a different teaching schedule, and which I thought we avoided by having to start at 5.
By the clock in press just to people up to
Yes. But isn't it on Oxford time?
It's on Christian time. I never, as an old newcomer, accepted that.
It's slightly behind Greenwich Mean Time. Yeah.
All right. Being that it is 11 minutes past the hour, we've exceeded the 7 that is Harvard's number, and we were going to commence tonight's proceedings. I just wanted to quickly welcome you all. This is the 5th event in a 6-lecture series this year, Africa and the Medieval World. And just a quick reminder that our last lecture in this series will take place on the 8th of April with Samantha Kelly from Rutgers University, who will bring us, in a sense, full circle back to Ethiopia, which is where we began with Steve Kaplan at the beginning of the year. So I hope that you all can be here. It'll be in this room again, 5 p.m. It's a Monday again, so we're being consistent in that respect at least. And we'll probably start at 5:11 again, like we did this time. I'd like to hand the podium over to my colleague and co-organizer of this series, Nicholas Watson, who's chair of the Department of English here at Harvard, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Before doing which, this is being a wonderful series, and some of you who've been around for a while will know that it's not the first Medieval Africa set of events we've run. There have been 2 conferences over the last few years. These have been put together by lots of different people. But from the medieval studies end, these events were kind of co-founded by myself and Sean. But I do think it's a good moment for me to recognize the fact that Sean has done the lion's share of all of this work throughout and continues to do it, and to acknowledge him as, in a sense, the mastermind behind much of what we're doing. So I would like to start by asking for a round of applause for Sean Gilstow. So Stephanie Wynne-Jones is a senior lecturer and also deputy head, bad luck, in the Department of Archaeology at the University of York, where she comes to us from there today. She studied in Bristol and then Cambridge, where she did her PhD. She then moved to Nairobi as assistant director of the British Institute in Eastern Africa from 2005 to 2008. Before moving to University of York on a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship, then as a lecturer, and now as a senior lecturer. She also spent 2 years on the magnificently titled Pro Futura Scientia Fellowship from the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies in Uppsala, where she was studying with an affiliation with the Department of Archaeology and Ancient History. And she's a core group member of the Center for Urban Network Evolutions at Aarhus University in Denmark. She gets around quite a lot within Europe, as well as within Eastern and Southern Africa. So her PhD research was based on the Swahili coast of Tanzania, specifically the area around a major Swahili town, Kilwa Kisiwani, that flourished between the 9th and 16th centuries. She's continued to work both there and elsewhere in Eastern and Southern Africa, especially Kenya, and I believe now Zanzibar as well, with a number of different projects focusing on Swahili towns, trade, material culture, heritage, and community archaeology. She's just completed a long excavation back in the area around Kilwa at a town called Songominara, which was a stone-built town, large but relatively short-lived, that flourished between the 14th and the 16th century. And she's writing up this excavation into a monograph, I'm guessing a collaborative monograph, and has published several articles. And I wanted to mention one of these, partly, I'm afraid, because it interests me a good deal for the ways in which it parallels work done by archaeologists on the locations of Christian churches in the region where my own work is based, Britain. And one of the things, as a literary scholar, I found finding remarkable about these talks is the portability of the work that archaeologists do and their immediate relevance to other areas despite their extreme specificity. This article is called The Mosques of Zongo in Their Urban Landscape, which she co-authored with Mark Horton at Bristol and Jeffrey Fleischner at Rice, which puzzles over the implications of the fact that this town of probably under 1,500 people had 6 mosques, which is a lot. Survey of the 4 mosques that remain to us, she notes, suggest a complex pattern of Islamic practice in the town, including a dynamic relationship between mosques and burials, an emerging sense of social difference within the town, and the active signaling of Islamic faith to visitors through the construction of monuments intended to be seen on approach to the town, which we've seen actually in earlier talks as well. And the article ends with what I take to be a challenge to architectural historians, by arguing for the need to situate the study of mosques within the wider urban and rural landscape. Too often, she says, mosques have been seen as isolated buildings. Here we believe that understanding their chronological and spatial context within the urban framework is central in not only interpreting their architecture, but also in placing Islamic practice with its wider social landscape. It's a very compelling article and argument, I think. Anyway, today, she's speaking to us to the title, Objects and Encounters on the Medieval East African Coast, and I'd like to ask you all to welcome her now. Great article.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for coming along, and also for the invitation to come here and speak. This is my first time in this Cambridge, and I'm enjoying myself already, and I'm very grateful to you for the invitation, particularly to Sean Gilsdorf, who invited me here today. As Nicholas has already said, I want to speak to you today on the title of Objects and Encounters on the Medieval East African Coast. This is a part of the world which is quite easy to think of as part of the medieval world, particularly because it was so closely interconnected with the medieval Islamic world, and particularly with Indian Ocean networks of trade, and of influence and migration that flourished throughout the medieval period. The coast has long been Islamic. It's part of this sort of Indian Ocean network of trade based around the monsoon winds, which, for those of you who don't already know, undergo this seasonal reversal, which mean that it's possible to sail in one direction between certain months of the year, so in the northern winter, the wind blows from the north and from the east, which would allow for sailing down the East African coast. And then in our summer, we get the southwest monsoon, which allows for a return journey. And this sort of combination of changing winds and also currents has long allowed people from around the Indian Ocean rim to interact. And in fact, we have intimations of a much longer sort of time depth to some of these connections, particularly seen in botanical and sort of food translocations around this region. This area, the Indian Ocean area, is often thought of as a world system centered in particular on the Persian Gulf. And there have been various historical reconstructions, in particular, particularly famously, Janet Abu-Lugod's work on the Islamic world system from the 13th to the 14th centuries, thinking about these sort of centers of economic and cultural power in the Persian Gulf, in northwestern India, and sort of drawing these networks of trade and interaction based around commerce and commercial interaction. So to some extent, we can tell the story of the Swahili coast in terms of its interaction with this region. So in this part of East Africa, there's a chain of settlements, essentially, from the Somali coast in the north all the way down to the Mozambique coast in the south. And this is a 3,000-kilometer stretch of coastline. So we've got a very large area which is united by interaction and commerce from at least the 7th century onwards, when we first get settlement along this coast. We immediately begin to see evidence for international trade, in particular ceramics that come from the Persian Gulf, like the turquoise glazeware jar that you see here. And we can sort of map the ebb and flow of these settlements to a certain extent in that record of the world systems that we already know about, with the Abbasid boom from the 8th century onwards, and the sort of rise of some of the Persian centers, or the centers in the Persian Gulf, particularly Siraf. We can see the influence of those trading relationships on the East African coast, and then sort of transition from the 11th century when we start seeing trade goods from further afield. We get porcelains and celadons and wares coming from China, sort of entering sort of the world system in sort of later centuries, in the 14th and 15th century. They become very common, and we can sort of think about the development and the economy of these towns in the context of that monsoon-based network. And we can also think about these sites as developing a very sort of cosmopolitan character through their interaction with this world of trade with which they were involved right from the beginning. And yet, this part of the world actually remains pretty poorly known beyond specialists in the region. And that's largely because there's no tradition of written histories here. So beyond a few mentions by travelers to the region, famously East Africa features in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. So we have these kind of 1st century AD records of trade and sites along this coast. And then there are various mentions by sort of travelers from the Arab world, really from the sort of 9th and 10th century, that make reference to this coast. But what we don't have is an indigenous written historical tradition that allows this sort of full incorporation of this region into those sort of text-based economic histories of the Indian Ocean world. And part of what I want to do today is therefore just to tell you about this place, to give you some kind of insight into medieval Africa as it was manifest in this part of the world. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done there. But I also really, what I wanted to do was to think about what it means for thinking Africa into the medieval world and for thinking about medieval Africa. And I suppose I have two larger points to make. The first is that the Swahili world is large and it's complex, and we need to think about all of it. And by that I don't mean geographically all of it, I mean socially all of it, and economically all of it, and not just these sort of little aspects that we can cherry pick that match with our conceptions of medieval from elsewhere. So it's not enough just to track objects that come from the Persian Gulf and notice that they appear in places in the Swahili world and think, okay, so they're connected, so therefore it's all medieval. We need to think about the context in which those ceramics were found, why they were trading in these goods, and what they did with these objects, and how that sort of fitted into a society and a community and a set of relationships, and sort of what made people engage with them in the first place. My second point is to introduce the fact, or to confirm the fact, I suppose, because I've listened to some of your previous lectures, and I know I'm not the first to say this, but that to think about the African past, the medieval African past, we need to start thinking across sources. So the lack of written histories is both a blessing and a curse, I think. It forces us out of our comfort zone and forces us to engage with a whole host of other sources, like oral traditions, historical linguistics, and for me, crucially, objects and material culture. And all of those tell stories in some very different ways. They all have their own rhythms. And in order to think about the medieval world in this region, we need to think about those rhythms and the ways that they can tell us the histories that we perhaps are interested in. None of which actually mattered to the earliest studies of this coast, to the archaeologists that pioneered research in this region. Archaeology on the Swahili coast really began at the tail end of the British colonial period here, among a group of largely British archaeologists who were very familiar with the Swahili culture that we see in places like Zanzibar and Lamu on the Kenyan coast. These stone towns, which are the inheritors of the Swahili tradition, and who very much think of themselves in that way, and rightly so, but which actually are much transformed through Omani colonialism of the 18th and the 19th centuries. And the Swahili, who inhabit these stone towns, have those very strong connections with the Arab world. They trace their roots to Oman and to the Arab world in particular. And so the first archaeologists in this region were already sort of trained to expect this kind of Arab origins and Arabic sort of connections for the sites of the coast. So they began to interpret the earlier sites on the coast, the earlier towns, as an earlier iteration, essentially, of Arab settlement in the region, an earlier generation of traders exploiting the African continent and acting as sort of middlemen into the Indian Ocean world. This also, we should say, we shouldn't exonerate them completely, this also fitted into some of the inherent racism of many of the ways that they understood the African past. But it was an image, it was a model of the past that was enthusiastically promoted by the contemporary Swahili. And it was sort of echoed in the origin stories that we find through the oral traditions of the coast. And this is a very short excerpt from the Kilwa Chronicle, which is an oral tradition relating to the town of Kilwa Kisiwani. It was first transcribed by the Portuguese in the 16th century, and it relates to the migration of a group of brothers, a family from Shiraz in Persia, who traveled down the coast, founding towns along the way, and it names a series of towns founded by Shirazis, Persians, including Kilwa. And this was the sort of origin story for Swahili towns that was promoted by contemporary Swahili, remains promoted by contemporary Swahili today. And so this sort of combination of expectations and the agenda of contemporary Swahili really sort of resulted in a misinterpretation of the early Swahili coast in terms of Arab settlers and migrants. Historians now have analysed the Shirazi traditions in detail, both as echoes of this very long-standing connections that the coast has with areas like the Persian Gulf, with the Indian Ocean world, rather than as literal records of a migration of people, but have also thought about the fact that these were transcribed, that these were written in a moment, and these were related back in this sort of colonial moment in which contemporary coastal residents were really navigating a new set of economic and political opportunities in which claiming Arab versus African ancestry had some very real and tangible benefits. It was also a conversation, actually a more internal conversation between coastal residents, between the sort of longer standing families who claimed Shirazi descent and the more sort of nouveau riche Swahili, who often were groups who'd come from the interior or who'd been non-elite groups on the coast who began to claim this Swahili identity in this sort of new moment of new sort of economic and political opportunities. So it was also an internal conversation about class. But so Swahili archaeology developed in the context of these kind of conversations about Arab migration and settlement on the coast. The first archaeologists really focused on the sites like Kilwa that you see here, where there were these sort of tangible monuments of this Arab colonial sort of past, epitomized for them in monuments like the Kilwa Mosque, which is built of coral and lime. This structure that you see here, actually, it's an 11th century foundation, but the domed extension is of the 14th century. So it's this very sort of early Islamic structure, which for them was evidence of the settlement, actually, of Arabs, of Muslims on the coast. This interpretation has now been rightly thrown out, a combination of linguistics, which has shown that Swahili is a Bantu language, rather than a sort of Creole of African and Arab languages, and archaeology, which has pushed the settlement of the coast back in time, have really sort of paid to the idea that the Swahili were Arabs that came and settled on this coast. But I think there is still a greater legacy in terms of the way that we understand the archaeology of the coast, where the stone towns, these sort of very cosmopolitan Islamic centers, have become the reference point for understanding even the earlier periods on the coast. And those sites are often understood in terms of what they became. And I think that has some ramifications for the way that we think about them. So for example, as I'm about to describe, some of the earlier sites don't have many of these features of towns. They have wattle and daub architecture. They're not necessarily Islamic. There are all these sort of ways in which they differ from the later towns, but they're often described as urban right from the start, really because the later towns were urban. So we're sort of looking back and projecting some of those characteristics back in time. The colonial archaeology of this coast did, however, give us some wonderful culture histories, actually, for many of these sites. And some of them still stand as the landmarks of Swahili archaeology today. So James Kirkman's excavations at Gedi in Kenya recovered the remains of quite a densely built coral stone town of the 11th to 15th centuries, based around this structure, which is known as the palace, but also quite a dense network of smaller stone houses lived in by other members of the town. The town was trading widely across the Indian Ocean. It has a wonderful assemblage of trade goods as well as local ceramics. And it really established this sort of way of understanding the coast and how it fitted into some of those coastal networks. Excavations at Kilwa Kisiwani by Neville Chittick went even further in understanding this sort of literate Islamic civilization. And he did work quite hard to try and tie it to some of the knowledge from the Kilwa Chronicles, these oral traditions, and to try to think through some of those dynastic histories that are recounted there, and try to understand sort of the development of the town in its own terms. We also gained a picture from some of these early excavations about the role of those towns as middlemen between the Indian Ocean world and the African interior. And in particular, the connections with sites in southeastern Africa and the Zimbabwe Plateau, where we see some of the early urban centers like Great Zimbabwe developing sort of in lockstep with some of the sites on the East African coast. And Kilwa in particular was known as a site for the export of gold, which we assume was coming from these sites down in southeastern Africa. And so as we see the growth of centres like Great Zimbabwe, we can think of it as being linked to this trade with the coast. And that is supported in many ways by the record of imported Indian Ocean ceramics found at places like Great Zimbabwe. And also the smoking gun of a Kilwa coin, which actually turned up at Great Zimbabwe and really sort of demonstrated this link tangibly. But it wasn't until excavations at Shanga in Kenya that really the ways that these towns developed from earlier African roots was demonstrated by an archaeological sequence. And this is quite a classic stone town. What you're looking at here is the town plan of the 15th century. So a whole sort of series of houses and mosques built of coral and lime. Across quite a dense urban plan, sort of sited on the beach, and with plentiful evidence for Indian Ocean trade. But what Mark Horton did through excavations in the 1980s and early 90s was to take this site back in time, excavating under many of the structures in the town to get a sense of the earlier town and to think about Swahili origins was really his aim, or urban origins in this part of the world. And those excavations are really epitomized by the sequence underneath the Friday Mosque, where Horton was able to trace back from the 14th century structure, this sort of stone-built or coral and lime-built mosque of the 14th century, back through, is it 10 earlier iterations, first of all, sort of going back through other coral-built structures on the same alignment until the earliest phase that he uncovered was a wattle and daub built structure on the same alignment, much smaller, but occupying the same space in the center of the site and dating to the latter half of the 8th century. And so what we have here, and what really was the story across the site, was this story of the development of a Swahili stone town from this early mud-built, so wattle and daub built site from the 8th century onwards. And Horton's story of this site was one of the gradual evolution of Swahili stone towns from African precursors. And that was an important story to tell at the time when we were still sort of in the process of throwing out those colonial stories of Arab settlement and migration to the coast. But the other thing that he did at Shanga was really to take seriously that earlier phase. And this is something which had not happened before. So, you know, people like Neville Chittick at Kilwa had talked about there being an earlier site and had even paid attention to the ceramics and tried to document some of the characteristics of that early fishing settlement, as he called it. But what Mark Horton did was to think about early Shanga as a settlement in its own right. And the scale of his excavations meant that he was able to reconstruct some of the ways that the town might have been structured in its earliest form. And he came up with a sort of schematic plan where he was able to think about an early site built entirely of wattle and daub around quite an open central space, which is where the mosque was located, but was also the place where there were many of these sort of large communal structures, which he called clan houses. And then in the surrounding sort of urban space, he was able to differentiate between different groups who had settled in that urban space. And you can see that the maritime traders were in the south, nearest to the coast, but through the associated artifacts and faunal remains, he also was able to point to areas filled with craft workers, with pastoralists, and to start thinking about this sort of early site of the 8th to 10th century as quite a complex, internally differentiated place, which actually is quite different from the later stone town. And there's a transition, which probably is another talk, because it's a transition that we see along the coast and actually around the Indian Ocean in the sort of 10th to 11th century, which at Shanga meant a destruction layer where the site was burned and the houses were deliberately dismantled. And there's a rebuilding in the 11th century, much more on the sort of stone town pattern. But this idea of the early town and sort of thinking about it as a place in its own right, this sort of early medieval, I suppose, East African coast, was one of the great contributions of the work at Shanga. And it also echoes some of the themes that come out in historical linguistic studies. And this is a table from Darren Ray's work on defining the early Swahili and thinking about sort of tracing concepts back in time through historical linguistics. And one of the words that I've sort of picked out here is the word that you can see appearing in Sabaki Bantu from about 500 CE onwards, which is the word word for town, but it's actually the word for a multi-component settlement. And the word muji, it's become mji today, or town. It also goes through this phase from the 10th century onwards, where it's more of a social definition. And in fact, both of those are quite social definitions. This multi-component settlement, this clan confederation, these are social definitions of a type of settlement which is quite internally diverse and segregated. And this is where we can sort of see this concept of urbanism starting to come in, defined through sort of social characteristics. And it works quite well, actually, with Mark Horton's early archaeology of Shanga. But the other big contribution of the work at Shanga, and one that I want to dwell on a little bit because it ties into some of my own work, was that at Shanga, as part of developing this sequence which tied these kind of early medieval wattle and daub settlements sort of through to the later stone towns and began to think of that as a continuous evolution, Mark Horton also gave due attention to the ceramic sequence. And he talked about, or he defined, a ceramic tradition, which ran all the way through the sequence at Shanga, and which he called the Tana tradition, after the Tana River, which is nearby. And within this tradition, he was able to show the sort of development, the evolution of Swahili ceramics, a sort of basic continuity through time, albeit with changes in form. But in particular, he recognized this type of ceramic, this necked jar, as we've come to call it, although it's a very wide necked jar with a very wide mouth, as perhaps you can see, and a sort of rounded bottom, which is characteristic of these early centuries between the 7th and the 10th centuries. So what was great about this was that not only did this means sort of finding these early precursors of the Swahili tradition in this sort of 7th to 10th century moment. But these ceramics also allowed a sort of geographical dispersal of the concept of the early Swahili beyond these towns, because actually these ceramics are found at a really wide range of settlements of this period, many of them not urban, many of them places that did not turn into urban sites of the 2nd millennium AD. And so we can start to think of the early Swahili, the early inhabitants of Shanga, as being part of this wider society, which is defined by this type of ceramics. Simultaneously, really, Felix Charmy was working on the same ceramics, although he calls them triangular incised ware, on the coast and the near hinterland of Tanzania. And he was showing really the wide range of sites at which we can find these particular type of necked jar. And actually, Felix Charmy was the first person to introduce the idea that maybe we need to think about this period, this triangular incised ware period, as a separate society, as something that's slightly different. It's not just Proto-Swahili, it's actually a different sort of 7th to 10th century moment where we have this shared material culture between the coast and the near hinterland. Although for him, because it was a conversation about sort of overturning, it was still this conversation about overturning the way coastal towns had been thought of as separate, he sort of remained sort of a bit torn between trying to look at this as a separate period and still trying to recognize it as an important moment in the urban origins of the coast. But I've, for a long time, been interested in early Tana tradition, or triangular incised ware, because I think it's really fascinating, actually. I mean, these ceramics are found over just a huge area. So, as I said, from Somalia to Mozambique, and we have early Tana tradition from Shibawayne right down there in the south. We're talking about 3,000 kilometers of coastline. And once you start moving inland as well, so Dakawa, this site in inland Tanzania, which is full of early Tana tradition, is 150 kilometers from the coast. So you've got actually this huge area where people are making and using this same kind of ceramics. And to think about those ceramics really just as a marker of some kind of social identity, to call them early Swahili, all these people from that whole region, it seems rather a simplistic way, actually, of understanding this ceramic sequence and what this ceramic evidence might begin to tell us. And I actually did a project a while ago now, actually, in 2008, looking at this early Tana tradition sequence and reanalyzing excavator collections from a series of sites, both along the coast and into the hinterland. I did it with Geoffrey Fleischer, actually, and what we set out to do was to look at these ceramics within a sort of full assemblage, because what we recognized was that early Tana tradition had become a sort of type fossil for, this is the early Swahili, this is this time period, and this culture that we can understand. And we wanted instead to think about sort of what those ceramics might mean, what people were using them for, who was producing them, and how they sort of fitted into a set of practices in those sites. And one of the things that came out of that study, which was quite an exhaustive sort of restudy of a whole of many thousands of sherds stored in collections along the coast, was that in fact there are some enormous similarities between these necked jars from widely dispersed places along the coast. Roughly the same form in particular was being made from Shibawayne to Manda up on the North Kenyan coast. And so we sort of reiterated that point, but we also looked at the fabrics, and we showed that each area had its own distinct industry that was making these ceramics. You get these regional combinations of temper and fabric that suggest that in each place they're being made locally by groups of craftspeople. And so in these widely dispersed places, they are recreating this same set of ceramics, the same forms and the same decoration in different spots. We were also quite interested in sort of how these fitted into the assemblage, and in particular, we were quite interested in thinking about the forms and what they might be for, whether these represented a particular form of consumption. And so we looked at the size and the rim size of many of these ceramics, and we showed, although it had been sort of hinted at before, we demonstrated that they were all sort of quite sort of large rimmed. They're called jars, but actually they look quite bowl-like to me. These large rimmed vessels designed for communal forms of consumption, and that's actually quite an interesting characteristic because it suggests that the reason people are making these ceramics is to supply a certain space and practice of consumption based around communal activity. And actually, we have long suspected that it's to do with beer, actually, because people drink beer from these sort of large communal vessels using straws. But unfortunately, I'm told reliably by my colleagues who do residue analysis at York that you can't find beer any longer in sherds from the 8th century AD. But whatever is being consumed, it's being consumed in sort of groups. These are not small vessels designed for individual consumption. This is a group activity, and it's a group activity that is found meaningful among this really sort of wide range of people across a really broad swathe of the globe, actually. But thinking about the fuller assemblage also brought us into thinking about some of the other types of ceramic that actually have been quite poorly served during this time period, because there's been this emphasis on demonstrating continuity between coast and hinterland, and the decorated jars really do that very nicely for us. There has been less emphasis on looking at the full range of things that people were doing. And in particular, one of the ceramic types which people have tended to sort of gloss over are these much smaller, much more decorative bowls that are really, they're associated with the same sites, they occur in the same assemblages, but only on the coast. And so all of a sudden, we've got these rarer, but relatively common types that start to distinguish some of those coastal sites from the interior sites. And what's interesting about these is that they're a completely different form of consumption being represented here, because these are small, these are individual and quite decorative bowls. And so immediately it brings you into a much more sort of individualized consumption space. It's sort of a tableware, is one of the ways that Neville Chittick described it when he talked about these types at Kilwa. And we can sort of start to think about it potentially as being linked to much more individual, elite, potentially, forms of consumption that even at this early moment are sort of distinguishing the coast from the inland areas. And it might be linked actually to certain types of food, like possibly rice that had started to come into the coast through the Indian Ocean networks at this time. I can tell you it's not linked to fish, because we have tried that. We tried to look for residues of fish on some of these ceramics, and actually you don't find fish in any of them, which is quite surprising because they ate a lot of fish. But so by sort of trying to get to grips with the ceramic record in East Africa, really what I'm trying to get at is that the material culture of these different times and areas is not just about, it's not just illustrating some kind of identity that we can tie to the early period on the coast. So it's not like this sort of Proto-Swahili identity that is indicated by just finding some of these early Tana tradition jars. Instead, we need to think about the ways that those jars are tied into practices, and why and where and how those practices were found meaningful, and how they might have tied into the creation of certain types of community identities. And we have that sort of broader area, that sort of consumption sphere that's represented by the early Tana jars, but we also have this much narrower and rarer spaces of consumption that are created by the much more elaborate bowls that we find at the coastal settlements. And what's quite interesting about these as well is that they might also be some of the earliest evidence we have for some of the practices of distinction that we find among later coastal populations. So later on the Swahili coast, we have indications that feasting and quite sort of elaborate and sort of elite consumption were very important ways that people negotiated relationships of power and authority. And we can perhaps start to see the earliest indications of these in that bowl-based ceramic assemblage from the 7th to 10th centuries. And then in the second millennium, from the 11th century onwards, we actually have bowl types predominating at coastal sites. So this is when we get a sort of break from the hinterland assemblages, and the coastal assemblages start to look very different, not just from the hinterland, but also from each other. And different sites have these different traditions of bowls. These ones in the center are actually from Kilwa, where they developed this tradition of quite highly painted bowls, actually red painted bowls. And this individualized consumption with people each having their own bowl rather than sharing this large vessel. And this has been linked to the sort of growing elite that we can also see through coral architecture, that we can sort of start to see through other forms of evidence like the coinage, and that these sort of practices of consumption seen in these bowls are indicative of that. It can also be linked to some of the external connections to some of the trade goods that are coming in at this time, including bowls. This is actually the cargo of the Belatung wreck, which is full of Chinese bowls, but we also have bowls from Persia that are cemented into, this one's cemented into one of the domes in a ceiling at Kilwa, and we have these sort of local bowl forms that are mimicking that. So we have this sort of bowl-based consumption practices that really come into being at this period, where we've also got these elites coming into their own on the coast. And perhaps some of the reasons why these are powerful is because of this sort of continuity of practices that we see from this earlier period on the coast as well. And one of the reasons I'm also quite interested in ceramics and how they can kind of speak to consumption practices and perhaps the sort of zones of community and authority and emerging elites is partly because ceramics are often all I have, but also because I've started, as I've looked more at local ceramics, I've started to see other patterns which aren't very well accounted for by some of the models that we already have. And in particular, this is what I'm hoping to work on next, actually. In particular, some of the more elaborate bowls that we see at Kilwa Kisiwani, a type known as Husuni modelled ware, which is associated with the big palace at Kilwa from the 14th century, and then this type, which is called wheeled ware, which is just after it at Kilwa, and it's all over the place at Sangomnara. They've always been thought of as Kilwa specific and all about the Mardali dynasty, which is this sort of 14th century dynasty that we get at Kilwa. But in fact, it turns out that both of these types are found across the Comoro archipelago, which is fascinating for lots of reasons. The Comores, we suspect, is an early centre of Sunni Shafi Islam, and the Mardali dynasty at Kilwa are Sunni Shafi. They claim that they come from the Yemen or the Hadramaut, but in fact, Eric Vallée has recently published all the sort of Rasulid archives from the Yemen, and he actually explicitly says, there's no record of this Mardali family in the Arabian Peninsula. And I have this sort of growing suspicion that there's actually a really important network of authority in this sort of southern zone of the Indian Ocean, nothing to do with that monsoon trade backwards and forwards to the Persian Gulf, but actually this sort of regional network of interaction, which we're seeing through these very particular types of elite ceramics and the consumption practices that they indicate. And so one of the reasons I'm quite interested in trying to think those things through is that I think it gets us into those kind of relationships that we perhaps can't see in other ways. And the indications about Islam, about the sort of lack of historical evidence for the Mardali, is not particularly compelling until you start finding these kind of categories of material evidence that can tie these places together. And again, I think what's wonderful about some of the local types of ceramics and the ways that they're sort of shared across this region is that it takes us away from just thinking about medieval Africa in the ways that it was connected with medieval world elsewhere. It's not just about, connections with the Persian Gulf. It's actually about understanding internal dynamics and the ways that people interacted within the region. Okay, so moving away from ceramics, I wanted to take you now to Sangomnara, which, as Nicholas said, is where I've been working over the last several years, from 2009 to 2016, excavating at this very beautiful stone town site, which is a sister site to Kilwa Kisiwani, and was only occupied really through the long 15th century, from the end of the 14th to the beginning of the 16th century. And it's been a wonderful site for lots of different reasons. It's a really fascinating snapshot of daily life at a Swahili settlement, sort of during this period, which was the sort of golden age of Swahili urban sites and of sort of trade in the Indian Ocean world. But what I want to talk about, actually, is one of the aspects that's come out of that work, which is, again, on this theme of trying to think through objects and how they can tell us different kinds of history. And I want to talk a little bit about value. And I came to this subject because Sangomnara is absolutely full of Kilwa coins, which are really interesting. The more you think about them, the more interesting they get. So Kilwa minted its own coins, and it did so from the 11th century. They minted silver coins, although these are quite rare, that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, that we only have silver coins relating to Ali bin al-Hassan, who was the Sultan, the first of the Shirazi dynasty in the 11th century. And there were a few very rare gold issues, which are from the 14th century. There's 3, in fact, to be precise. But there are thousands of copper coins, and they date from the 11th through to the 15th centuries. They relate to a whole series of different sultans. And they're really interesting for lots of different reasons, actually. As I said, they're minted at Kilwa, and we know that. Chittick talked a lot about the coin record, and he spent a long time trying to match the coins with the various sultans mentioned in the Kilwa Chronicle and sort of trying to marry those two records together. But they're really only found in the Kilwa area. So as I said, Songomnara is a sister site to Kilwa. It's on this sort of southern island in a drowned estuary, which creates this Kilwa archipelago, as it's rather grandly called, with Kilwa on the more northerly site. And there's a few other sites in this area, including Sanjia Kati, and Kilwa coins are found across these sites. They're also found up on the island of Mafia, which you can see just north of Kilwa, which was known to be under Kilwa's dominion, and nowhere else. So we have these coins which are circulating within the area of Kilwa's authority, but they're not moving on. They're not going to other places. Now, coinage, the idea of coinage comes from the Islamic world. The caliphate, the various caliphates, would mint in gold, silver, and copper or copper alloys. And actually, copper coinage in the Islamic world is already quite varied. It wasn't under such strict control as the gold and silver issues. But normally it was this sort of item of petty exchange, whereas the gold and silver was sort of the main event. Whereas at Kilwa, copper was really the main event. And this may be partly because of the value of copper in this society. We know that in Eastern Africa, copper has always been quite highly prized. It's got some inherent qualities which are very similar to gold in many ways. It's very shiny. It's aesthetically very highly valued. And the other sort of aspect of the coins that's really interesting is that they echo some of the styles of the Islamic world, but they're all completely sort of esoteric and unique to Kilwa. So they use Islamic script, but the style is this rhyming couplet that goes from the obverse to the reverse with the name of a sultan and then an honorific that invokes Allah as well. And so we have this kind of local style in a sort of local material of a sort of foreign idea, but it's used locally. And that's what sort of challenges some of the notions about coins and currency more generally. There is this sort of assumption that coinage is about trade, it's about commerce, and this quote from Gervase Matthew sort of epitomizes that in that he didn't find any coins at Songomnara. To be fair, he didn't dig, but he suggested that this meant it wasn't really a considerable commercial center. And so coinage is really sort of linked to the idea of commerce and potentially even to international trade. Whereas actually that's not really what it was doing in Kilwa. The coins circulated locally in this area of Kilwa's authority. At Songomnara, we found them everywhere across the site. In every house we excavated, they're in the middens, they're in the kitchens, which I think means the women probably had them too. We found them as offerings on graves. The big sort of red circle you see on the left was actually an area where we found wattle and daub houses, and they're also full of coins. Everybody has coins, and they were moving around the site, and presumably they were used as a medium of exchange. And one of the nice ways of indicating this was that we also found clipped coins. And so if your coins represent a quantity or a fixed value, then you can cut it up, you can halve it, you can quarter it. And so by finding clipped coins, it sort of suggests that there's this trade, this petty exchange going on in coinage, and that coins are being used to pay for items around the town. So what we have with the coinage at Kilwa is this sort of domestication, really, of an international idea. And although we have this kind of Islamic styling to coins, and in fact the very idea of the coins comes from the outside world. They have these sort of notable local features. They're mostly of copper. They're also interesting because certain sultans really became very enthusiastic, obviously, about minting coins. And those sultans, who are always in the majority in all the assemblages, are the same ones that are remembered very strongly in the oral traditions, in the Kilwa Chronicles. And I actually wonder in which order that happened. In fact, when you have an oral tradition, were they minting a lot of coins because they were exceptionally sort of powerful and important and rich? Or are they very well remembered because their names were circulating for 500 years in the coinage of these towns? So it's quite a good way, perhaps, of making yourself remembered. So the coins already are interesting because we have this sort of case study about value and the ways it related to local authority. With these coins, it doesn't relate really to the quantity of metal in them. So a coin normally, the authority stamped on a coin, is a guarantee of the quantity of metal that you're receiving. Whereas these are extremely variable. The weights are very variable. The sizes are quite standardized, but the weight is not. So it's not really about the quantity of metal. It's more about the coinage itself and potentially about the links to a particular sultan. But the other sort of final thing about the coins that's really interesting is the fact that they allow us to establish some relationships of equivalence with other objects. So we found a deposit of over 360 of these coins in the foundations of one of the houses of Sanghamnara. It was actually together with this very nice carnelian necklace, which was probably imported from Gujarat, from northwestern India. And these deposits, where people were literally building value into the foundations of their houses and then plastering them in under the floors, they weren't meant to be retrieved, are found in houses across the site. And all of them are different. So in this case, it happens to be some coins. In another house, we found a pot with an iron hoe in it, in the same position, in the same house. But in the house next door to the coins, we found these, in the same position, in the back room, in the same corner, buried in a small pit in the foundations of the house. Now, these are large beads, some of them 8 centimeters across, cut from aragonite, which is the shell of a giant clam. So to make something this big, you need a really big giant clam. And these were sourced by free diving down onto the coral reef, and they were made at Sanghamnara. And what's lovely about finding them in this location is that it gives these objects, which already are really interesting for lots of reasons, it gives them a sort of equivalency with that deposit of coins and this sort of idea of building value into the foundations of the house. And so by doing that, we can start to think of these also as a store of value or an indicator of value. And what's wonderful about the aragonite beads is that they are so very local. So actually, after we found this, I went back through the literature and I found Chittick did find a couple of these at Kilwa, but we don't have them elsewhere on the coast. So it seems to be this sort of local industry of producing aragonite beads. And it's not only sort of found in the foundations of the houses with this sort of equivalency with the coins, it's also part of a faunal assemblage at the site and an artifactual assemblage which really shows an interaction with the marine environment. So they're going down onto the reef for these, but they're also fishing the reef for most of their food. They're gathering shellfish, they're eating and using and working with animals like turtles and dugong. And they're also, of course, mining the coral to build their houses and using the mangroves. So that there's this whole sort of interaction with the marine environment, which is really sort of summoned up by these objects of the aragonite beads. The way that they're produced, actually, they're napped. It's a lithic technology. And we know that because we found an aragonite workshop on the western side of the site, along with many more aragonite beads, not all of them as large as this, many smaller ones, which presumably were going on to be worn or potentially traded with partners elsewhere. So we have this sort of very local industry, this napping technology, working aragonite is not something that we see elsewhere. And yet, in this context, it becomes this sort of store of value that can in some ways be equivalent to money. So I think the example of the coins already is this wonderful example of the ways that the Swahili coast sort of domesticated foreign styles, and the fact that understanding the medieval period here is not just about sort of spotting those kind of characteristics that might be recognizable from elsewhere, but it's about trying to think through the ways that they were manifested and used in this place and by these people. But then by bringing in the sort of equivalency of other objects that held value, we can sort of take that even further and start to think about how those objects that perhaps are sort of more recognizable from places elsewhere were part of a much sort of richer repertoire of interactions with objects and things that held value in this society. All of which sort of brings me back to my broader point, which is that thinking through things is not the same as looking at texts. It's not just a different way of getting at the same histories. We don't write these sort of economic histories of connectivity through looking at coins at Songomnara or through looking at ceramics at hinterland sites in Tanzania. Objects instead sort of invoke this different world of practices and production, particular ways that people are interacting with the material world and the particular qualities of that material world as well. And so the range of material culture on the East African coast sort of brings us to, it alerts us to many of the practices and activities that are bound up with identity, sort of community cohesion, on different scales, like some of the ways potentially that the relationships between the coast and the hinterland might have been understood could have been through those sort of communal consumption events that are represented by some of our ceramics. And likewise, these sort of practices of distinction that we can see sort of echoing through the ceramics of the coastal assemblages were also sort of part of the ways that people learned to understand their sort of place in the world and how they related to other people. And in my book, A Material Culture, I tried to sort of draw this out and developed the idea of trying to think about biographies of practice rather than archaeologists often talk about object biographies, actually, and trying to trace sort of the changing meaning of objects through the use life of objects. But I'm actually more interested in practices and how you can sort of try to trace practices as with practices of consumption and sort of individual spaces of consumption and conspicuous and sort of high status consumption, that maybe have a sort of longer biography and into which objects fit. So when, Celadon becomes available and is brought into coastal assemblages, perhaps some of the reasons why that is valuable and it's worth having is because it fits into some of these practices of conspicuous consumption, of these individual table settings, of these sort of glamorous ways that elite groups were sort of negotiating their status in society. And that might be sort of one of the reasons that people were interested in navigating this world of Indian Ocean trade. And thinking about objects also obviously allows a reconsideration of local material strategies, concepts of value. And I hope that that ultimately allows reflection back onto some of the things that we take for granted, perhaps in Eurasian medieval studies, like coins. And actually it's quite interesting once you start sort of questioning where value comes from with coins, you can reflect back on some of the European examples. And there are some wonderful studies already, particularly in the Viking world, actually, of some of the ways that coins versus silver held value and sort of thinking through that relationship in a slightly more complicated way. So I often find myself brought into global medieval conversations. Actually, I was part of the Geraldine Heng and Susan Noakes Global Medieval project. I've been part of an Oxford-based Global Middle Ages network, and I know that it's because this area is poorly served by history. I know that they're bringing me in really as a sort of backup plan, but histories don't do a good job of representing this area. But I also hope that I do more than bringing in a different geography, actually, because by bringing in archaeology and actually also a little bit of anthropology in some of the ways that we try and think through our concepts of things like urbanism and value, and some of our categories, we're actually sort of challenging medieval studies in a different way, not just bringing in African examples, but actually trying to tell a different story from a different range of sources. And I really think it's important that those sources also bring in a much broader range of people. And this is sort of my point again, about the fact that you can't sort of pick and choose which bits are medieval. You can't say that coins are medieval, but villages with no coins are not medieval when they're just next door. And I think archaeology and dealing with the material culture of a region really brings in those different sets of people. It brings in craftspeople as well as traders. It brings in farmers. It brings in this whole sort of range of people from different classes and places into the ways that we sort of try and build these medieval constructions in the East African world. Okay, thank you very much.
So we're going to have time for some questions, but I would welcome everyone to go and graze and to consume other liquid things while the questioning is going on, because I know there's like blood sugar issues, I'm sure.
I also should say that my answers get better the more you drink. So.
And the more she drinks, exactly. So, Jenny?
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. So your discussion of kind of Kilwa coins and kind of the very regional specificity of it, I have kind of two questions related to that. One, where does the find of that coin in Great Zimbabwe fit into that discussion? Mm-hmm. And also, maybe this is cheating a bit, but having read your book and knowing that there were some Fatimid coins also found in Kilwa, knowing where, like, how does that fit into this story? And then a secondary question is related to the production of ceramics and the development of that technology on the coast. Where are kind of ceramics being produced, and what is that kind of firing technology? Like, are these high firing kilns? Or can you explain more about that production practice?
Yes, I can. Those are all good questions. So the coin at Great Zimbabwe is a coin of Al-Hassan ibn Suleiman, which is a 14th century coin. And how does it fit in? It sort of doesn't. In that it's a single coin, presumably it travelled with a person or as a stray object that was valuable. What it isn't is a sort of cache of coins, or it doesn't seem to have been part of any kind of meaningful exchange in terms of coins. I mean, there are several Kilwa coins that travel, and there are stray ones. Actually, at Shanga in northern Kenya, there's several Kilwa coins in amongst the finds that they've got there. So they do move. Actually, there's one in Australia as well, but I think that's a different story. But they do move, presumably with people. But what you don't have at Great Zimbabwe is an economy based on the exchange of coins. So it's just a 14th century moment when a coin moved, indicating the direction of movement. Yes, we also have quite a lot of foreign coins on the coast, and lots of different ones actually. There's quite a lot of Chinese coins. There's Fatimid coins. There's a lot of different ones in different places, and it's hard to know how they were used. Actually, there's a really fascinating find, which is fascinating in lots of ways, from Shanga, which maybe you know actually. It's a bronze lion, which is in this style of Indian craftspeople at the time, but then analysis of the bronze shows that it was made from melted down Chinese coinage, actually, because it has the exact alloy of sort of imported coins at that time. So there's also this use potentially of coins as a raw material for metalworking. So yeah, it's hard to know, really. They were brought in and used in different ways. Maybe they were also a medium of exchange. Maybe they were kept as curios, displayed in these wonderful sort of cabinet of curiosity type displays that Swahili people have in their house. But they weren't as obviously used as sort of media for exchange, for circulation. But yeah, they were known about. You know, these were cosmopolitan people who were very aware of that world. It's just that they were doing something different. And the pottery is all very low-fired. Actually, there's no kilns in East Africa. And so it's very variable. And in fact, the Comorian stuff, or this, the ceramics, the Hasuni modelled ware and the wheeled ware that you see on this southern circuit is quite notably well-fired, actually, compared to some of the rest. So you do often, you have sort of pockets of skill, I suppose. But there's no kilns. And what our study showed, and what other people have intimated, is that it was very local kind of areas of production. So possibly even sort of household level production. In fact, I did an ethnoarchaeological study of potters on Mafia Island, and that was all like really household level production. But in the past, it may have been more sort of on a larger scale. But yeah, it was all very local.
This is a really great talk. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. There's so many different directions that are interesting to pursue. I have two questions and a comment. And the first one has to do with the challenge that you kind of put forward at the very end of the talk about thinking about terminology that we use in various aspects of the study of the past. And I was struck by your discussion in the early part of the talk about urbanism, and how one thinks about urbanism in this part of coastal East Africa in relation to specific places, and your reference to the, I think, Swahili term of muji, was it? Yeah. As being something that relates to the kind of social definition of places. And it made me think about the nature of urbanism, and also why the word town occurs so much in your talk and the discussion of places that are urban. I understand, as I understand them in this area, because in China we have a habit of taking the one of the terms that references urban places, which is cheng, and which relates to the physical nature of the place, and thinking about it in the deep past as being as making the application of the term city perhaps go further back into contexts that are maybe less urban than one might think of as cities. And here you have contexts that are quite city-like in many contexts, but the term that's used is throughout the talk, and I understand probably throughout the discourse on this region, is town. And I kind of wonder how loaded that is in terms of contemporary discourse on towns versus cities and what the implications of those are. So my first question is, can you comment on that? But I'm going to ask my other question first so you can just ramble. The second question concerns this Tana ceramics that you talked about, and it mainly comes up because today I was reading for a course on technology I'm doing on Wednesday, a paper by Rita Wright written in 2002, where she reflects on the application of the interaction sphere model in Eurasia to thinking about the nature of certain types of ceramics that are spread over a large area, like 3,000 kilometers in length. A very similar situation where she's specifically talking about how you have regional subdivisions of that interaction sphere that was presented much earlier by Karl Karlowski and Maurizio Tosi, and how the communities of practice responsible for making these ceramics within particular regions were feeding into an interaction sphere that concerned a shared ideology, and this is the question, a shared ideology that related to the production of similar ceramics, but by local potters. And so the second question is whether there is an ideological component that is being materialized in the ceramics that are being produced in a very similar fashion by potters in different places within this coastal area that are these Tana ceramics. And then my comment, which relates to these ceramics, is that you mentioned that your colleagues at York suggested that beer residues can't be identified in them, so this is a hopeless cause. And this struck me as surprising, and maybe just this reflects my ignorance, but there has recently been work done in China on Neolithic ceramics where they're claiming residues of beer 9,000 years ago, specifically focused on degraded starches and starch grain analysis in ceramic contexts. And in fact, the exact analogies that they're using in terms of talking about forms and the physical material culture associated with these things that they're using to supplement the residue analysis is drawing analogies from African ceramics and beer consumption. So it surprises me, and maybe it's just that the people who are doing this work are kind of over-interpreting the starch grain analysis, but that's just a comment as to maybe there is hope for finding beer in these things.
Yes, actually, well, I'll have to quiz them when I get back to York, but they. So what we've done in York is a lot of lipid residue analysis and isotopes, and actually we haven't looked at starch grains, and maybe that is a way in. Yeah, but they are getting closer to identifying isotopic markers for millet, which is actually what the beer would have been made out of. But there are so many things you can make from millet that I'm not sure that would necessarily prove that it was an alcoholic beverage. Yeah. Okay, so your two other questions. So one was about the ideology associated with shared ceramics, and what would that be? What kind of ideology? I don't know. I don't know if I can answer this question, so I'm going to throw it back to you. What's an ideology that results in a shared ceramic tradition?
For example, the Tana ceramics, that I saw on the slide, seem to all have a similar type of decorative style on them. And so if there was some sort of ideological set of ideas that were being reproduced in the signs that were components of that surface treatment. Perhaps then you have this shared nature. I mean, they're all similar shapes and similar type of decoration.
Yeah.
Maybe that has a meaning that is necessary, or that is necessarily being reproduced.
That's part of the process. Yes. So the short answer is I don't know. But actually, there is a really evocative little piece of evidence, which was excavated by my colleague Jeff Fleischer and Adria LaViolette, who I think was here a couple of years ago, in their excavations on Pemba. And but it's the only one I know of. But they excavated actually a copper ring from this period, which has that same design on it, that the infilled triangle. It's like a Tana ring. And so it does suggest what you're talking about, that there's something meaningful about that design and about that what's going on there. But it's unique. It's the only piece of evidence I know of that suggests that. So it's sort of intriguing, but difficult to comment on. And then what was your first question? Yes, urbanism. Well, so there is a literature about this, and in particular, a sort of theoretical literature about the colonial legacy of archaeology in Africa, and an unwillingness among African archaeologists more generally, actually, to talk about cities, and that there's a really trackable tendency for us always to talk about towns and never really to talk about cities. And so it's possible that I'm just falling into that tradition, and that it's a way of underestimating the African past, and that certainly is possible. There's definitely a tradition of talking about stone towns and about Swahili towns. For my own purposes, I have actually thought about this quite a lot, and I think Swahili towns are actually quite small, and I often am struck by the scale of them. They have all these sort of urban qualities and characteristics, but they're actually surprisingly little. and I find myself uncomfortable with using the word city for a settlement of maybe 1,500 people. I don't know, it just feels wrong to me. And so that's why I do it. But perhaps I'm also falling into this sort of larger tendency, yeah. Certainly Greek city-states are often mentioned to me as parallels for sort of Swahili towns. And they potentially are not much bigger, so maybe I should just get over it.
One of us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pity we don't have more Africans here tonight to listen to your lecture, particularly those who are concerned with the history of Islam, that part of the world. It seems to be, it seems to me that obviously analysis of material culture is bound to give us new meaning and new interpretations about what happened, beyond the fact that the Kingdom of Oman was connected with this whole Swahili coastal cities and Islam, and the exchange, and Islam was established. My first question relates to the statement you made earlier on about the language, Kiswahili. It seems to me that it is still a pretty deep tradition that people see it as a mixture of Bantu and Arabic.
I know that
and given the fact that you have, Arabic words are pretty heavy in that. But that's just by the way. Ali Masuri was the doyen of, African, East African history and also in religion. And I remember we were always asking him that why has it been that in the understanding of slave trade in Africa, that there were some silences that came from that part of the world. And of course, he will tell you, his own ancestors were connected with the same questions you're asking. But it seems to me that now that maybe that archaeologists are getting more and more interested in what actually happened. We are bound to have a revision of that, and perhaps have a better assessment of the role they played in that part of the world as it relates slavery. And of course, when I saw the last sets of photos you showed with those coins, with the coins that you were trying to tell us, when some of us discover similar things in the West African situation, it was very hard at first to understand what was going on. But oral tradition, through Ifa divination text, suggested that it was a kind of a banking system.
Right.
There's a link between that, even though that in fact there was a story of this goddess called Ajay, goddess of wealth, who was the first, we would then later say, to establish the first banking system. In actual fact, after the end of the colonial rule and money was changed, and in the colonial rule, and they brought in new forms of currency, pots of coins were discovered in the forest. So which supported what oral tradition told us about this goddess called Ajay, who was fond of carrying money around until Ifa asked her to begin to perform a ritual and save this money somewhere. So there was that kind of relationship. So my question for you is that kind of interpretation possible? Could it have been that what we were dealing with here is a kind of an attempt to bank their money rather than, I'm not saying that you're wrong, but I'm trying to look at other possibilities based on what we have seen in West Africa.
You mean the deposit of coins under the floor? Or just coinage in general?
Wasn't it through excavation that you were able to discover that, right?
Under the floor, yes.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And certainly in European contexts, when people write about hoards and things, there is that sense that those buried deposits, people are going to return to them. But the ways that buried deposit was found, sort of built into the foundations and literally sort of plastered in under the floor. There didn't seem to be much sense that it was going to be returned to. And certainly once we started finding these similar deposits in other houses, that seems to have been the case. And in fact, Songamnara was abandoned. After the Portuguese arrived, the town was just abandoned. And that might have been a good moment to dig up your coins and take them with you, and they weren't then dug up in that moment. So I don't think they were a store. There have been finds of Kilwa coins in pots and things, sort of stray finds. Chitik writes an article about a pot of coins that was sort of delivered to him in Kilwa Masoko. But it's a bit unclear the context from which they came. But it's it's fascinating to think about. There's also so John Middleton, who was an anthropologist of the coast, wrote about the Kilwa coinage, actually, and he wrote about the three metals, the gold, silver, and copper, and his informants told him that the gold and silver would be kept as sort of family stores of wealth and kept in the houses, whereas the copper was used for petty exchange. The problem is that we have no evidence for that in the past, and so it was sort of a way of trying to understand this trimetallic system, and it is possible that it functioned in that way and that those gold and silver coins just disappeared into other economic systems later. But certainly what we know is about the copper coins. Your other question about people still believing that Swahili is a blend of Arab and African. Yes, people do still think that, but they're wrong. But there are a lot of Arab loanwords. But when analysis was done of Swahili historical linguistics, they showed that a lot of those loanwords were actually of fairly recent date, and they relate to that Omani period on the coast, and they relate to sort of aspects of taxation and sort of commerce and things that came in sort of at that period and were named at that period, rather than being basic to the grammar, which is a Bantu grammar. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, and then we have to let our speaker eat.
I feel like now the pressure's on to make these questions better than they might be. But thank you very much. It was a fantastic talk. I'm really interested in sort of connections between the coast and the interior. And so I have sort of a three-part, not to follow Rowan, but a shorter three-part question. One is the evidence on the ceramics. For the Tana stuff, do you know, have you done chemical analysis of the clay? That is, are these stuff in the interior made in the interior, or are they made on the coast and moved to the interior? So that's part one. The second is there evidence for things moving from the interior to the coast? I know in later periods you've got things like ostrich feathers and ivory and these sorts of things moving inland. Are there things in the medieval period that connect the interior to the coast? And the third one's a little bit of a wild card. And what is the thinking on the banana? What's the dates on the banana at this? Is it still like 2000, 3000, or are we talking medieval or something more recent? So
Yeah.
Those are the three.
That's a very unfair question for me. So What was the first question?
Are the ceramics locally made, or are they brought in
Yes.
from the coast?
I think they're locally made. So what we don't have is any petrographic study and analysis of clay sources. And actually that would be a huge job, given the scale of the area and the number of potential clay sources. But what we can do is instead look sort of internally at the assemblages and see that they're coherent and they're different. So the ceramics from Dakawa are very different from the ceramics from the nearest coastal settlement. And so we have that sort of distinction, but we can't know that they didn't come from somewhere else.
I just had a thought on that. I actually think because the coast is limestone, you actually probably could tell coast from interior.
Yeah, maybe.
Clay is pretty straightforward, I would
Although
think.
they use very sandy tempers as well, and you get that in the river valley where Dakawa is. But maybe, yes. I actually, as part of the project I would love to do about ceramics between the Comores and Kilwa, I have a dream of doing a petrographic study, actually, which would get into more detail on some of these issues. But the thing about Dakawa, actually, which is the furthest inland site where there's a really significant assemblage, is that actually that was the site which was the least diverse assemblage of any that we looked at. It was pretty much all necked jars. And so if they were coming from somewhere else, they really were bringing the whole assemblage with them. They weren't just bringing a few pots. So Shibawayne's a bit different, actually. At Shibawayne in Mozambique, there's a much more diverse assemblage, and the jars are just a smaller part of it, and I actually do wonder if some of those came from further north. But Dakawa, I really think it's a localized phenomenon. Yeah. And as to things coming from the interior to the coast, well, actually pretty much all the trade goods we know about that went out through the coast came from the interior. It's possible that we have ostrich eggshell beads, and I've actually heard informally that some studies that have been done on shell beads on the coast are now coming back as ostrich eggshell beads, so they're potentially coming from those southern African trade routes as well. Otherwise, we don't have a lot actually of sort of objects. We know those connections were there, but the objects presumably were passing through. Yeah. And the banana, I think the situation is exactly as you remember it. I think there's this evidence for early banana, but it's not, but people question it because it sort of sits on its own, and it's still sort of, what is it, 2,000 or 3,000? It was like a decade ago. I didn't know if that's yeah, but to my knowledge, it hasn't moved on. I think there have been new findings of bananas and banana phytoliths, but they're all sort of later in periods we knew it was there anyway. I have some, actually. Oh, good. Nicholas